Holistic Health and Fitness is honestly the Army's most exciting program.
We are a holistic organization
where we really invest in the warfighter.
Giving you skills not to just do your daily job, but to be extremely successful in the outside world or as a civilian.
Welcome to All You, where anyone can be all they can be.
So the HUF program is Army's approach to readiness and lethality.
It's a chance to really create a population of, in this case, tactical athletes or soldiers.
I actually commissioned into the Army for H2F.
It's an approach at, creating fitter, faster, stronger individuals.
That hits all the different domains: nutrition, sleep, spiritual, physical, mental.
And if we make small changes and improvements in these areas, we can maximize performance and lethality.
So I love this dialogue that we have now about being holistic.
We really truly believe that we are created body, mind, and spirit. Holistic health and fitness encompasses all of those.
Sleep. If you're not sleeping, you're taking away from so much of what people like to call the gains, right? Nutrition, same thing. If I don't put fuel in my gas tank, my car's not gonna go.
All these domains interact with each other.
So being able to work just hand in hand with those other partners.
I see now 100% why all the pillars are just as important to each other.
It's a one-stop shop. It's an all-access. Everybody's all in, making sure that we're exemplary warfighters and extraordinary professionals
that ultimately, hopefully, have a chance to, be healthier, live longer, essentially be all they can be if they are willing to actually, put the work in and reap the benefits of it.
It really continues to be that secret sauce that allows for human performance to be even greater than we ever thought.
And everybody can benefit from that. There's not one person that cannot benefit, from having, more discipline, more consistency.
I would tell my civilian counterparts, this is one of the only jobs that you do where you got to be in shape all year round.
Thanks for watching, everybody.
This is just the start of an amazing series.
So hopefully you'll get engaged with this and really seek this holistic approach in improving your quality of life.
And just remember, it's all you.
And we will see you at GoArmy.com.